Hi there. Welcome back to our third conversation in To Be Continued, an ongoing conversation unraveling the threads and carrying on the conversations from my time in the UK this past summer. I am here on the unceded and traditional territories of the Hamakuyam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It is an ongoing honor and responsibility to be here and to continue unpacking what it means to be here in a good way, how I can be in best relation with the place, and how we can collectively be modeling that together. And textiles is so ingrained in what has led us to now and our relationships to place that I have always thought textiles is the place we need to return to in terms of how we reapproach what it means to decolonize, what it means to have reconciliation. Cloth needs to be at the center of that story. And so all these ways we can be coming back to that. Thank you for being on this journey of learning with me. And I'm really thrilled to invite Zoe to be with us today. Zoe Gilbertson, who's in Devon now, is a fashion ecologist and textile systems designer, and is the person to start the Bast Fibre Network, based now in Devon. But Zoe also has a history of being here on these Coast Salish territories, working with a company in Vancouver. So it's really particularly delightful to have Zoe kind of return in a way to Vancouver, and knowing this place, this land, and the surrounding islands and the coastal shores that we're going to be talking about in our own Bast Fibre networks. Zoe, I'm thrilled to have you bring your knowledge and your ideas and wisdom and learnings and research to share with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Yeah. It's really nice to reconnect with Vancouver again. It was a long time ago that I lived in Vancouver, but my daughter was born there. So she has the potential to move back. She has a Canadian passport, but she's 20 now. So yeah, it was a long time ago, but yeah, very fond memories.
Nice. And I'm just going to say that Zoe and I met because we were both on a panel together that was being hosted at the Remakery. And we didn't have a lot of time to talk between the two of us, but like every question that was asked from the panel that either of us answered, the other was kind of like turning like, what they said, that's what she said. That's yes, yes, we need more time together. I think we were really kind of struck at our similar thinking and ideas, but coming from very different perspectives, because I've come from being an artist and doing community-based projects, and you've come from industry and is it right to say from academia as well, in terms of
Sort
what you
of, I
brought
guess
in?
I dabble it. Yeah, I dabble in. I teach sustainable fashion education a little bit now. Yeah, yeah. So from both angles.
And the fellowship, the Churchill Fellowship that you did
Mm.
for this research, can you tell us a little bit about what that was, or the duration of that research project?
Yeah, so that was Churchill Fellowship is really brilliant because they award them if you have a sort of a pressing, an urgent desire to research something of value in another country, and then bring the information back to disseminate it to the UK. And it's usually for those people perhaps who might not have access to similar funding in academia, or people who are out there in the world doing things. And so, yeah, I basically got an award and decided to travel around Europe looking at people, looking at basically people with systems that can not industrially, but can process bast fibers. And I was looking for people who might be doing it in smaller ways, because we have to begin small when we're learning how to do these things again, but also from a perspective, I believe in small scale systems. I believe small is beautiful. I believe in small farms. I believe in distributed production. So I was going there with that lens to see what I could find, and it was a month or 5 weeks of funded research, basically through Europe. And then I came back and wrote up what I'd learned, and I learned a lot.
Wow. 5 weeks, because reading, because it's almost 100 pages. That was a dense 5 weeks. That was a lot.
It was. I met a lot of people and a
No
lot of
kidding.
time.
That's
Yeah, but
incredible.
I also had done an MA at Schumacher College, which is quite a transformative centre of ecological education in Devon, and so I had kind of started the process a couple of years before that through my dissertation for that work, and so and I'm still researching now. There's stuff in the report. I'm like, oh, actually, I've learned a bit more, and I would go back and tweak it. So it's a continual learning journey. Nothing's ever static or right. You know,
Yeah.
perspectives
Yeah.
change and evolve all the time. So yeah, I'm just always on that learning journey, I
That,
think.
yeah, that makes perfect sense. That totally
Mm-hmm.
tracks. I think with all of this, I think of it even from the perspective of when I make a garment that's soil to skin, and more often than not, I find I've finished a garment and then I'm kind of going back. It's like, oh, I could have done that differently, or can I unpick that? And I'm going to remake that cuff isn't quite right. So, that's, I think with all of this, we are relearning and going back and looking at things from the contemporary lens of, okay, what was done right before, and perhaps what was done wrong, and the disregard for the land, the disregard for people. How can we make changes? What are the new pieces that need to be elevated in how we consider going forward and building back systems that are better, for mutual support. And I think often about how we can fast from food for a day, but we cannot fast from textiles for a day. Even a nudist is still going to need to dry themselves off when they get out of the shower. They're still going to need a shower curtain to stop their floor from flooding, right? We still are washing our dishes with a dish towel. So cloth is so ingrained in our
Hey, I like that.
lives that we just don't
Yeah.
even think about it. It's
Yeah, it's true. It's true. We take a
yeah.
lot for granted.
So I'd love if you want to screen share, and we can see the presentation or parts of. I know you're going to kind of cut through some of it to keep it a little shorter, and we can then have conversations and return to pieces.
Yeah, if
Questions
anyone's a
come
little
up.
bit confused at the end, we can come back and review stuff because, like you say, there's so much information to condense because it's a big subject, and everyone here will have aspects that they are much more familiar with than others.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to let you
Right,
screen share, and I'm going to turn my video off.
thank you. Okay. Can you see this? Does this look clear?
Yes, that looks great.
Excellent. So, yeah, so basically, to cut a long story short, I've been involved in sustainable fashion for over 20 years. But in that time, the use of fossil fuel based fibres and production of fast fashion has increased exponentially. Um, and it's completely and utterly out of control. So what I'm looking at in my work is what can we do to change this? So we're in a time of crisis, which is generated by extractive, exploitative economic production causing multiple interlocking issues, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, war. That is just continuing to get worse. We all know this. That's why we're here. So what can we do about it? We've all got a different lens and a different way that we approach our response to these crises. And the lens that I use is currently used because these things, our knowledge evolves and change all the time. But these two concepts, I really believe that they they support the way I think, and they support what I want to do, and they're helpful in explaining it. So you're probably also familiar with this, but a bioregion shares ecological, geographical, and cultural characteristics. It's often defined by a watershed or geographical boundaries, but it's fluid. Those boundaries are fluid. So it's a really nice term because it can escape political boundaries, and it's kind of nebulous, but that's a good thing, I think. And commoning is an activation of relationships that bind communities together. And this means collectively caring for social networks, knowledge, cultural practices, heritage, resources, which are shared for the benefit of everyone in the community. So bringing these two concepts together, it creates a framework from which I want to experiment and build new ways of working together in ways that are outside of markets and prices and capital, and outside of the existing frame of reference that we currently all live in. So also, I'm sure you're familiar with a fibre shed, but a fibre shed is within a bioregion, and my bioregion can provide wool, flax and linen, hemp and leather. So I am working to translate the ethos of the commons into practice within local fibre and textile systems. And as we discussed, I recently had a Churchill Fellowship looking at small scale machinery and cooperative methods. So I went through Europe by train and then had some online discussions with some people in Canada and the US. And the aim was to create open source networks of bioregional cooperation and knowledge transfer. So I had many questions, and I won't run through them here, but basically I was looking at what's the appropriate scale and corresponding context of processing machinery for flax and hemp. What's the balance between handmade embodied and industrial extractive systems? Is there a sweet spot? Just to give us a little bit of help, because we all know handmade, it does take a very long time if you want to produce more than a small amount of fibre. So basically, how can we do this, and what infrastructure will support this? And also, what metrics, stories, and metaphors can we gather to communicate and support this change, this paradigm change, as we go through this process? So yeah, I won't go into field to cloth with linen and hemp at this point, but just to say that most flax straw is grown in France and Belgium. In the world, a lot of the world's flax straw is grown there, but 90% of it is shipped to China for spinning and processing into textile, and then a lot of it's sent back to the UK, to Europe and North America in the form of yarn and garments. So there are a lot of people working in Europe at different scales to try and basically create European textile systems. So I visited people working in small scale systems and also larger systems to learn from both. So I stayed on an organic dairy farm, organic mixed farm, where they have organic rotations of dairy cows where the milk is sent off to a cooperative, but they also have arable crops, and the holistic grazing systems work in combination with different crops. And the French have a very good knowledge about which crop should go before flax, which crop should go afterwards, what can you do to prevent and suppress the weeds. So that farming knowledge is also really important for people who are maybe starting to grow on a slightly larger scale. Looking at the machinery, so also at field scale, so beyond an acre or a hectare, you need to start you need machines to weed. If you're going to grow organically, then machines to pull the flax and turn it, lift it above the weeds, and then to bale it. So we need all of this machinery in the UK. We don't have any of it. I visited, a lot of you will be familiar with this, but visited a small processing setup in a university, which is an engineering university near Lourdes in the south of France. And there's a professor there whose focus is spinning. He's developed a small scale spinning facility of bast fibres and is an expert. And I wanted to see his scale of machinery. So I went to see the taproot machinery. It was great to see that in action. Yeah, I've got a short video of it here. If people haven't seen it, I can run through that. This is edited greatly because it is quite a slow process as it is right now. You can see the flax is clamped and it's going into the breaking rollers. So that needs to go back and forth several times to break the flax. You can see how gorgeous the flax looks as well. You know, the French, they really do know how to grow their flax and get it to a very fine quality. So it's going through the rollers a few times. Then it goes into the scutching section. You can see the shives dropping off here. They don't collect the shives because they're not really interested in that part of the process, but in a farm scale or in a processing setup, you would collect the shives. So this is the scutching section. So this is where the blades are going around and bashing the flax to remove the woody core, the shives. You can see how, so it goes through there a few times. And then once it's gone through that process, it now goes into the hackling section. You can see it's changing state somewhat into the hackling combs, which move up and down. And this was the really slow part of the process. So this took at least 10 minutes to move this flax through the section to have done the hackling correctly. So in France, hackling is not often done by the scutching facilities, and you can see some of the tow coming off in this process. So this hackling can often be done by the spinners, so the spinning factory. So you can see it coming out beautifully. It works wonderfully. And then you'd need to unclamp, turn it around and do it again. So it was very interesting to see that in action. And also the next, sorry, my slide's not moving on. Here we go. Yeah, it was brilliant to see the small scale spinning machinery that Pierre Ouguin, who runs the facility, had set up. So some of this machinery they designed and developed themselves, and then some of it they bought from Linificio, which is an Italian spinning manufacturer. But basically it worked really, really well, and it was quite a small setup, but I think you could probably produce quite a lot of yarn through this setup. So it was really positive to see that. So moving on to thoughts around how do we create a fully integrated supply network. So part of that process is understanding and visualizing all the different parts of the chain. So this diagram shows the processes, places, and people that could potentially be involved in any supply network. And I think it's possible to vertically integrate these stakeholders and roles with any revenue from end products fairly distributed. And this could provide financial security and resilience throughout the system. And I think this is the work that we're looking at now. This is quite a long, involved process involving lots of people. How do we make this relational? How do we make this fair? How do we make this the time involved distributed evenly across the system? So this is one of the things, it's a work in progress, but it would be great to discuss this more a bit later on. Looking at scale, just to give you some context, to start up a large scutching mill would cost around £15 million. I've got this in pounds, but I'm guessing I think it's about double that in Canadian dollars, maybe a bit less, or in other currencies. But you get the point that it's a lot of money, and it would service 3,000 hectares of land and has the potential for 3 million meters of cloth per year and 2.2 million pairs of jeans. But obviously, lots of different things would be used, the fiber would be used for, but this is the scale we're looking at. A medium scale scutching mill would be about 3 million to set up and would service around 1,000 hectares of land. And this is in the French sort of commodity system where farmers sell their scutched flax kind of on the commodity market. And then if we're looking at small scale scutching mill, this is an estimate, but I think it would cost around between 100 and 300,000 to set up. This doesn't really exist yet. So some people are finding secondhand machinery around the world, but to sort of set up at this level. So it would service around 32 hectares of land. Has the potential for around 30,000 meters of cloth, which is a lot of cloth, but not a lot of land, which I find really quite interesting here. And then you can even go at the smaller scale, which is a really inexpensive setup, around 15 to 20,000, and it would service 1 hectare of land. And this is when I think it starts to get affordable for people to start thinking about maybe collectively owning a small scutching mill. And there are people, particularly people I work with in the UK, are looking at, okay, how do we make this small scale distributed machinery that would be able to cope with this amount of cloth and realize, say, 740 pairs of jeans, which you could see as being a reasonable amount to start a business with. Spinning mill scales, just for info, spinning mills are really expensive to set up at the large scale. They also use an awful lot of energy, and the bigger things are, the more energy they use proportionally. It doesn't actually use less energy. The proportion of energy used for the output gets bigger rather than at bigger scale rather than at small scale. So what we're looking at is really, how do we set up a Maker Lab style scutching mill, which would be really cheap and people would be able to, well, it's still a cost, but you can see that through grant funding and so on, we could potentially raise a much smaller amount of money than trying to get, a very large scale spinning mill. So the vision with this, so I've got the UK here as an example, is just illustrating how you could support through going small scale, maybe having a mix of small and mid scale, you could support a much wider range of people and have distributed centers of production, which then shares the work and distributes the revenue as well in place, rather than centralizing it into 1 or 2 people if it's a company that owns the means of production. Whereas if we can distribute the means of production to more people, then the benefits and the value of that will be shared much more widely. And that's what underpins what I do. So I think how we set up any processing infrastructure is really important. And focusing on small scale production is, and if you do this, you can allow processing facilities to emerge initially where the energy of the region, where the people who have the energy and the desire for it can support it, rather than it coming top down and a government saying, we will provide the funding to set up a mill here, but you have to create X jobs and blah, blah, blah. And someone needs to match fund it with the investment. Whereas if we can do it ourselves in a small way, then we can support the new systems to develop how we want them to develop, rather than somebody telling us how to do it. So one of the things I was also looking at was hemp, because hemp is a very holistic product, and it's potentially a more resilient crop than flax. it can outcompete weeds, and some say it is easier to grow in an increasingly volatile climate. Some say it's not. So that, again, is still an open question. But it does grow very big, and it can create a lot more volume from the same field. I think the case for hemp and building materials is very clear, as it's easier to process, but textiles, they're also viable, although the yarn will be thicker. So maybe you can make jeans, upholstery, thicker products. I think once you try and make hemp really fine, you need to use chemical treatment. You need to use a lot of energy, a lot of processes to get it fine. So I think it would be good if we were to accept that and think, okay, we can use linen for finer things, and hemp can be used for more rustic, durable things, and other textiles like rope, nets, those kind of things. So in terms of looking at vertical, integrated and regional manufacturing, this company, Le Chanvre de Atlantique, is very interesting. So they have started with the hemp plant itself. They've worked with organic farmers in their local area. They've worked initially by starting with creating hemp oil and building materials to create value from those. And then they've spent 5 years researching textiles to learn how to do it in France appropriately. And now they can make textiles, and they're thinking about investing in a scutching plant themselves, but they will own the means of production themselves. They will have everything vertically integrated in this amazing hemp building that they built, which doesn't require heating or air conditioning because of the way that the hemp regulates the temperature of the building. But they did have a large amount of capital underpinning them to set this system up. So they've had millions of euros basically to support them. So I was just thinking, how can you translate this lovely business, which is still operating on quite a large scale? How can we do the same thing but slower? So they basically integrated everything under one roof, and they're amazing. They're really interesting to talk to, and they do everything in the right way, but they do have quite big backers behind them. So going back to this idea of, okay, how could we create a seed to garment commons? How could we share revenue and time in the production? So if we were going to do this vertical production, so if 1 hectare of flax can produce 1,000 meters of fabric per year, say 740 pairs of jeans, or so on. These are, this is just an estimate. This is an estimate at this point. We could work back from the statement to experiment how the value could be proportioned fairly in relation to time and monetary value in a more distributive commons-based system. So if you said, let's create a local box scheme, for example, to produce a pair of jeans, we could do this if 740 people paid £20 a month, which is a lot, I know, over the year, to the collective producing group. This could generate an income of, say, £185,000, which sounds like a lot. And now this would mean the jeans would be sold worth £250. But there could be a way, which is a lot, but I think it's probably the true value if you're actually going to pay for the time and the labor to do this. But some people could come in and work parts of the system to then reduce their cost, and you could build community through this. And I think I've just done this roughly. I think the actual making would probably take the most amount of time. And the actual farming on this, it does look like a small amount of time. But if you think about it, they've grown 1 hectare of flax, but they could be paid, say, £3,000, which is a really good amount for a farmer to receive for growing something. But the farm could maybe receive an aspect of the share through providing the building, or maybe hosting the scutching machinery, or maybe being involved in some of the process. So there are lots of different ways you could visualize and work out this system. But I think it's just a starting point to think about how could we think about doing this differently. Another thing think about doing differently is trying to get food and fiber into the same conversations. So get people to think about, what it's like to produce food and what it's like to produce clothing, and how much land is needed for both. Because we eat food, if you think about our bread or other things that we grow, we eat them, and that needs to be constantly replenished. But with jeans, with textiles, we can grow them, we can capture the carbon in the textile, and then we can wear it for a long time if we look after it. So it doesn't need to be something that keeps needing to be replenished like food does. So, because quite often people say, but what, we need food for land, how do we do this? And I really think that flax and hemp can be really, really beneficial within a organic arable crop rotation, because they bring a bit of biodiversity, and they bring difference into the rotation, and they can be built in without taking away from the really important part of growing food. So yeah, 1 year's bread supply could equal 4 pairs of jeans. But the land, to feed a UK population, bread requires 400,000 hectares of land, so 50 square meters per person. But to clothe the population in jeans requires only 13 square meters per person. And you would not need to do that every year. So this is just fun things to think about. But basically, yeah, it's interesting to explore. So yeah, I've covered a lot of different concepts and things here, which we can talk about. But basically, this is me here with farmers, designers, developers, jeans manufacturers, hemp growers, linen growers in France. And this is l'Échange Bio, and they do a yearly trip. And it's an organization that really supports French farmers, growers, designers to produce French localized systems. And yeah, it was brilliant to join their trip together. And yeah, I really think we can do this. We can create a common sense paradigm that can work towards a more cooperative commons. And clothing and fashion have got the opportunity to help people experience the joy of working with local materials and understand the value of putting natural, social, and cultural capitals above financial. So yeah, this is where I'm going with this. And yeah, that's the end of my talk there. That was a whistle stop whiz through everything, but yeah, hope it was enjoyable.
It's fantastic. Yeah, there's so much there, Zoe. Thank you. Thank you for all of that. And lots of pieces that really struck me. And we're in the process right now with Earth Hand about thinking, I have in a volunteer position held many hats as the organization has just kind of grown, and ideas, and I've started new things and things have taken off, and I just keep putting more hats on top of more hats. And so we're in this process of figuring out what does it look like to create a cooperative model for all the pieces that are primarily on my shoulders with assistance from different board members, but what is it looking like to kind of like pull open everything that Earth Hand is currently holding and inspect that from a perspective of how do we create systems that are interconnected, that everybody is participating in the labor, in the decision making, and essentially turning how we manage our 2 environmental learning gardens where we grow artist materials into a cooperative. And in the back of my head, I'm always thinking how in the industrialization that has happened around the world, we have lost so many of our hand skills, but we've also lost our collaborative skills of how we work together, and what does commoning even mean, and how much of that is something we have grown up with an embodied sense, or a socially rounded understanding of what that means to be a part of a collective, as we've become more and more individualistic and accustomed to putting a credit card down or paying whatever to take care of our needs that have been outsourced for others. So backsourcing that to take care of ourselves and within our own community, within community, that's in and of itself a whole skill we are looking to build back, right? And so in the back of my head, I'm always thinking that this work that we're deeply invested in now is hopefully also the foundation for what becomes potentially something larger and links into the agricultural basin that surrounds the Lower Mainland. How are we creating models that maybe then can open up further for supporting larger models? Something I love the speculative math, the speculative thinking. That's one of my favorite areas, personally. And I played with your numbers a little bit because I was just kind of intrigued at the different scales of models, and the notion of the mid-scale, which was $6 million. And I think I've translated that. Did you say it was about 3 million pounds mid-scale?
Yeah.
Okay, so that notion is 1,000 hectares of land would employ
Yeah.
employ 15 people and create 1 million meters of cloth or 750,000 pairs of jeans. And so I thought, okay, well, the Lower Mainland, what's the Lower Mainland population? Our population is around 3 million. So the notion of that 1,000 hectares being able to put one pair of jeans on every Lower Mainland person every 4 years.
Every 4 years.
Which is perfect, right? It's kind of like you
Yeah.
think about
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
many loaves of bread you need and I think it was 50 loaves of bread per person in a year. Well, so for the Lower Mainland, that
Yeah.
notion of having 15 people employed to be able to put a pair of jeans on everybody's bum. uh,
Don't think it would be 15. It would be 15 people probably in the processing, the early processing stage, but not in the manufacture of the jeans
right. Okay, so we can
or the
expand that
cloth.
out
But it
in
would be
terms
a
of
lot more. That was,
awesome.
yeah, yeah, that's probably a
That's
little,
even better.
yeah, that would employ a lot more people than
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing that comes up for me a lot in this work is the notion of where the curated inefficiencies can be from
Mm-hmm.
the perspective of there's some work that we love doing and there's some work
Yeah.
that's tedious, uh,
Yeah.
tedious or physically hard, and uh, we want to be using machinery that we have access to. But there are lots of places, when um, I was chatting with Alan, we both talked about how much we love the spinning process. And there
Mm.
are people that love spinning that would be wanting to do the spinning themselves. Uh,
Yeah.
and in the same way, there's Claire from Contemporary Hempery talked about how much they love the hackling. And
Mm-hmm. It's
hackling is
quite
just
satisfying.
such a
Yeah.
set, right? And so even recognizing how, and I think this would be different for every community, but for any
Mm.
community that is kind of building their own um, ecosystem of production, that there would be the places that it makes sense to have the love labor that create the opportunities for people
Yeah.
coming together, having those seasonal connections, having that labor that you step into with community that also becomes the community building um, moment that reminds you of why you are in this community with these other human beings. And so those touch points that can be built
Yeah.
into any
Yeah.
system. And
Yeah. And you're creating that flexibility maybe for different people who might have different yeah,
yeah.
different favorite things. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think 2012 was the first year that I grew flax for linen here in some sidewalk plots in the Strathcona neighborhood. And what we were really struck by, we did a grow along with the same seed, the same season. Um, and I think we had 17 or 18 different community participants. This was a couple
Mhm.
of years later on, but it reinstilled the notion of terroir and
Mhm.
how we talk about terroir in wine, and many
Mhm.
people are familiar with the concept of terroir from that perspective. And in Europe, it's spoken of, I think, more in terms of even thinking about wheat and the different types of pastry or bread that can be made depending on where something is grown. And we don't think about that in textiles anymore at all. And this is something I think we need to be bringing back into people's minds is just even the notion that maybe some years are years that we grow really fine linens or fine quality hemps in certain regions, and in other areas it's going to be coarser cloth. And
Yeah.
that notion of even where a community could have that awareness to be flexing a little bit of like, oh, this is the year that we are taking care of our like essentially our jute bag needs. This is not going to be the fine clothing is not coming out of this year's crop, with perhaps some areas that would be exceptions to that. But that notion of even disregarding the homogeneity that we've come to expect with everything coming from the land. I've heard of in France where, you know, the flax man is the person who is going around to the different growers and is kind of choosing when the equipment is going to be going into the different fields, knowing that some fields that might be going in a little bit later, their
Mm,
quality might not be as high, but that is going to rotate every year. And that notion of having the individuals in the community who are being able to sort of see the broad lens of what's happening in the different farms, and recognizing that, oh, this is what we're probably targeting this year is going to be the fine linen coming from this region of the province, or the sturdier rope hemps are going to be coming from this area of the province, and where those shifts might need to happen each year in the production and expectation, and just our change of thinking again.
mm. Yeah, but having the knowledge needed to do that will take years and years to build up.
Yes.
About building that slowly, and that's what small scale will support, that level of knowledge, because actually a year is a long time, isn't it? You just get one shot at the growing season, and then it's just like, oh, another year goes by, and then next year will be a different quality from year to year, probably even when you grow it in the same place. um yeah, it's interesting. There's a project in Portugal that I came across, where I didn't visit them, but you can find it online, but I always forget the name of them. And they basically grew a Portuguese landrace variety. So they grew traditional Portuguese flax, and they had a very different way, because obviously they had irrigation, they had different timing. It was quite a different way to grow it. The processing was the same, but the flax was absolutely beautiful, really, really lovely, gorgeous flax, but half the size of the normal variety that you would get, um, the normal variety that you would be able to purchase if you're a farmer going to grow flax. And obviously that variety is there for length, and it's a compromise between its height and seed production and quality of fiber. But if we were to be more flexible, we could grow amazing varieties. And then also, if you can develop place-based varieties, that, and then you could potentially grow seed that's much more resilient in that particular place. But you might then, like you said, decide, well, this variety, it's amazing here and it's going to grow amazingly, but we know it's going to be only good for twine or rope. But this variety grown here, we get less of it, but it's so beautiful. And yeah, having that knowledge and understanding would be an amazing place to get to. But I think it's good to have that aim. It's really good to have that aim.
And I think all of this comes back to the importance of the relationships, and the
Mm,
notion of having to have the time to build the trusting relationships of how people are working together, and have the capacity to get through the pinch points and the tensions that will come up,
mm,
and to sort of have that trust in each other and in systems building forward. And I'm curious now, because I'm still really fixated on the denim. As I loved your 740 pairs, 750 pairs um, to a hectare, and what that looks like. And so we now have on the West Coast here, we have Carol Highland from, oh, I'm just going to lose the name of the farm in Saanich, um, Nope, it's gone. It might come back to me in a minute.
Alderley Grange.
Elderly.
Thank you, Alderley Grange Farm. So thank you. She is now growing seed for sale that is the dual, depending on how you want to sow it, dual for seed as well, seed production as well as linen. And
Really? Oh,
yes,
wow.
yeah. And so the Lenore,
Where's that from?
they're in Saanich on Vancouver Island, and Alderley Grange is the name of the farm. And so, you know, when I've been telling stories to talking and talking about textiles and the history of textiles and, you know, where we are in fast fashion, and there's so much that is heavy and depressing and hard and feels just like, what can we do? We just kind of feel helpless to it all. The notion of the story of flax and linen is the one place that I always feel is hopeful, that I like to share with people. And even in terms of my early days in 2012, we were getting our seeds from the Hermitage in Pennsylvania, and they were getting the seeds from Holland. And by the time I had ordered the seeds and he had received them and then shipped them to me, sometimes they would arrive 3 weeks past the best sowing date.
Yeah.
And the kind of craziness of even the seed access that has been so challenging. And here in a decade, we now have a local seed grower who can pop seeds in the mail to me with Canada Post, and I'll get them in 2 days' time, or I can meet her at the ferry terminal. Like, that to me is phenomenal. So also recognizing how far we've got to go, how far we've come. So my
Yeah.
next question to Carol, I'm curious to know, how many kilos of seed is she producing at this point in a year? Because I think she's on year 5 or 6, with the notion, coming back to what Claire shared with us, that it takes 90 kilos of seed for, I'm talking about hemp here, but 90 kilos of seed to plant 1 hectare. So we need 90 kilos of seed for that 750 pairs of jeans. So I'm just even curious how far away we are in flax. I know flax to hemp is going to be a different seed ratio, but on that speculative mathematics equation, I'm kind of curious to see where we're hitting in there. And
Yeah, I think it might actually, I do have the information somewhere. I'd have to look it up, but I think it's less than 90 kilos.
Okay.
And also if you were, and I would imagine if you're growing a seed, if you're growing a dual variety where you're sort of trying to get some seed and some fiber, you might sacrifice the fiber fineness, but that might be fine if you're wanting a pair of jeans.
Right.
But then for seed, you would use less.
Correct. Right.
Spread out further. So
Yeah.
I
Almost
don't think it would be
half the weight of
90
seed.
kilos. Yeah, I think it would be
Yeah.
less. But yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing to think about. So we're not even close to that in the UK, and seed production is something that I worry about, really think about, because if you want more people to start growing it, you have to produce seed. But I think if you do grow for seed, you can grow quite a lot in a fairly small area. But it would be really interesting to find that out. And also back to just to go back to the 1 hectare equals 740 pairs of jeans. Somebody within the network said to me, "Oh, I've done my calculations, and it's not not that much, because I didn't account for any wastage in the cutting of the jeans." So well, it might be 700, 670, but ballpark. And we might be able to make some tiny things from the waste as well, I'm sure.
Well, and then even also rethinking how we're cutting, so that we are working with a zero waste pattern. Like, let's just kind of like embody that in the design aesthetic that we take forward. Yeah, I want to wrap ourselves up here so that we can carry on the conversation with those that have joined us live, because our time is running and we've got some great people with us. Before we sign off, I wanted to share something I've been living with on my wall that I think is appropriate to just give some voice to. I'm going to just hold up the poster here. So this is actually seed paper that is hand printed with vegetable inks, and it is the PhD thesis of Jill Price from Queen's University called Unmaking Methodology to Disrupt Anthropocenic Perspectives and Gestures Towards Land. So Jill's PhD was completed, I believe, a year ago, and we will be planting the seed paper this year in one of our learning gardens. But I wanted to read out a couple of the pieces that came up for her in this work. She essentially interviewed many artists who are doing work in unmaking in their own creative practice. I was very happy to be one of those and honored to be one of those people. And so some of the things that have come up in the interviews she did with people that really fit this, the notion of descaling towards an ethic and aesthetic of degrowth, deglobalize to support regional revitalization, dematerialize ego to embrace collective thought and action, decenter commodity fetishism to enact preventative and reparative actions, decenter consumption to explore reinvention. And there's a few others, but I'm going to end on this one. Decenter apocalyptic thought to imagine and co-build utopias. And I just love that one in particular because I think that's where we're at here is this co-building of future utopias that bring textiles back into our systems. And I will put the link to this in the YouTube channel conversation, and I can forward that on as well, because I think there's all this crossover, all these cross points.
Yeah, excellent, amazing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Zoe, for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And as always, to be continued.
Thank you for having me. That was amazing.